This is a true story. May 1942, southern Alberta. The Canadian Pacific Railway delivers 10,000 German prisoners of war to a temporary camp near Ozada on the Stoney Nakoda First Nation Reserve. They arrive from North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps has been defeated. Soldiers of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe pilots, Kriegsmarine sailors, most captured in the desert campaigns that turned the tide against Germany in Africa. They step off trains into tents erected on prairie grassland with the Rocky Mountains visible to the west. 12,600 prisoners eventually crowd into 3,400 tents surrounded by 28 guard towers and barbed wire. The largest concentration of enemy combatants ever held on Canadian soil up to that point. They expect harsh treatment. Stories circulate among German forces about Allied prison camps. Propaganda from Berlin describes brutal conditions, starvation rations, forced labor, physical abuse. But what they encounter in the foothills of the Canadian Rockies contradicts every expectation shaped by years of Nazi messaging about the enemies of the Third Reich. The guards are old men, veterans of the First World War, now serving in the Veterans Guard of Canada. Too old for frontline combat overseas, but physically capable of supervising prisoner camps. These men who fought Germans a generation ago now watch over a new generation of Germans with weapons, but without hatred. They remember the trenches of France and Belgium, where they learned that soldiers on both sides suffered equally under orders from distant commanders. They treat the prisoners not as enemies, but as men following orders, just as they once did. The Geneva Convention governs everything. Signed in 1929, the international agreement mandates humane treatment for prisoners of war. Canada takes this seriously, more seriously than many combatant nations. The prisoners receive adequate food, proper shelter, medical care when sick or injured, recreation opportunities, the right to wear their uniforms and insignia, the ability to practice their religion, protection from physical punishment or degradation, every provision the convention requires, and more. Canadians living near the camps notice immediately. The prisoners eat better than civilians under wartime rationing. Guards acknowledge this openly. Same provisions as Canadian soldiers, but the prisoners have better cooks, more time to prepare meals. The veterans' guards eat the same food and admit the German kitchens produce superior results. This creates resentment among some civilians who see enemy soldiers dining well, while Canadian families ration butter and meat. But the Geneva Convention demands equal treatment, and Canada complies. By November 1942, two massive permanent camps open at Lethbridge and Medicine Hat, purpose-built facilities designed to hold 12,500 prisoners each, the largest prisoner of war camps in North America, larger than any camp in the United States, where the biggest facility holds 15,000 total. Each camp costs $2.3 million to construct, 143 acres of land, 36 two-story dormitories housing 350 men each, 6 mess halls, 6 educational buildings, 6 workshops, 2 recreation halls measuring large enough for 3,000 men, a 125-bed hospital staffed by German doctors and orderlies, sports fields, libraries that eventually hold 26,000 books and 19,000 textbooks at Lethbridge alone. The prisoners organize themselves, create orchestras, Camp 133 at Lethbridge develops a 55-piece symphony orchestra under conductor Johann Onken, a 34-piece chamber orchestra under Hans Singer, multiple dance bands, a mandolin and guitar ensemble. By November 1944, the Red Cross reports 45-piece orchestras, 55-piece bands, and numerous smaller musical groups performing regular concerts. Professional quality performances of German classical composers, popular music, dance numbers. The recreation halls fill with audiences of fellow prisoners appreciating culture maintained despite captivity. Sports become central to camp life. Soccer tournaments between dormitory sections. Hockey in winter on rinks built by prisoners. Tennis, handball, boxing, wrestling, gymnastics, skating, track and field events with measured courses and jumping pits. Basketball and volleyball in indoor gymnasiums. Table tennis, chess, bridge, poker. Every activity men need to maintain physical fitness and mental health during years of confinement. Education continues. Prisoners teach each other trades and academic subjects. Those with university degrees instruct classes in mathematics, engineering, languages, history. Others teach carpentry, metalwork, art, music. Libraries stock technical manuals and textbooks. Men study subjects they never had time to learn during military service or before the war. Some earn equivalents to university credits through correspondence courses. Art flourishes. Prisoners create paintings, sketches, engravings, wood carvings, metal work. Exhibition halls display their creations. Initially, only fellow prisoners can view the work, but eventually guards and select civilians receive permission to purchase pieces, with proceeds credited to prisoner accounts. The natural beauty of the Alberta landscape inspires landscape artists who capture the mountains and prairies in watercolors and oils that families back home will never see. May 1943. The Canadian government approves German prisoners for agricultural work. Labor shortages devastate prairie farms, where young men have enlisted and shipped overseas. Sugar beet harvests require intensive manual labor. Farmers desperately need workers. Prisoners provide the solution. Those willing to work receive 50 cents per day, paid into accounts they can access for camp purchases or save for eventual repatriation. Canadian authorities established 9 temporary farm hostels surrounding Lethbridge at Barnwell, Iron Springs, Magrath, Stirling, Park Lake, Coaldale, Whiteside, Welling, and Turin. Prisoners live in these smaller camps and work daily in the fields under guard supervision. The trust that develops surprises everyone. Veterans guards leave loaded rifles on truck seats and ask prisoners to move vehicles. Prisoners are given rifles to hunt game during logging operations in Northern Ontario bush camps. German soldiers who weeks earlier fought Allied forces now handle weapons and return them without incident. Guards and prisoners develop relationships based on mutual respect rather than hostility. Some farmers house prisoners overnight or for days without guards present. The prisoners work hard, prove reliable, become essentially part of farming families who rely on their labor to save harvests that feed Canada and support the war effort. By 1945, over 11,000 prisoners work across Canada, 2,200 in sugar beet fields around Lethbridge, thousands more in logging camps supplying timber for construction and paper production, farm labor throughout Manitoba and Ontario. The economic value becomes substantial. The government receives $22 million in 1944 from prisoner wages. Estimates suggest $80 million saved that year by employing prisoners in military installations and essential industries. The prisoners themselves save their earnings. Plan for futures. Some dream of remaining in Canada after the war ends. Curious dynamics emerge inside the camps. Hardcore Nazis maintain power in some facilities. They organize internal administration, enforce loyalty to Hitler through intimidation and violence. Prisoners who speak against Nazism or express democratic sympathies face beatings. Isolation, death threats, mail censorship by fellow prisoners prevents news of German defeats from spreading. 2 prisoners are murdered by Nazi kangaroo courts that try and execute men deemed traitors. Canadian authorities eventually identify Nazi leaders and transfer them to isolated camps. By late 1945, denazification programs begin changing camp culture. As Germany's defeat becomes undeniable and repatriation approaches, Nazi influence fades. Prisoners realize bad behavior might delay their return home. Want to discover what happened when the war ended and 6,000 Germans made an impossible request? Subscribe now for forgotten stories of Canada's surprising role in World War II. May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders. The war in Europe ends. Canadian prisoner of war camps hold approximately 34,000 German combatants. Everyone expects rapid repatriation. Prisoners want to go home, see families they have not contacted for years, rebuild lives in a Germany free from Hitler's regime. But many face a different reality. Letters from Germany describe utter devastation. Cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombing campaigns. Hamburg flattened, Berlin destroyed, Dresden burned, Cologne, Frankfurt, Munich, all heavily damaged. Infrastructure collapsed, industry demolished, millions homeless, food scarce, economy non-existent, uncertainty about zones of occupation, rumors of Soviet brutality in the East, questions about whether homes still stand, whether families survived. The prisoners who worked Canadian farms and logging camps face an additional complication. They grew comfortable in Canada, learned the language, made friends with guards and farmers, experienced treatment far superior to anything they expected as prisoners of war. Many have no family remaining in Germany, homes destroyed, parents dead, siblings scattered or killed. Some served in the Wehrmacht because they were conscripted, not because they supported Nazism. These men see no future in returning to ruins when they have built relationships and developed skills in Canada that could provide good lives if permitted to stay. 6,000 German prisoners formally request permission to remain in Canada. Nearly 1 in 5 of all prisoners held by Canada. They petition the government, write to camp commandants, express willingness to work, to contribute, to become productive citizens of the nation that treated them humanely during years of war. Canadian authorities are sympathetic. The country needs workers. Immigration policy favors those who can contribute to economic growth. Agricultural communities support keeping prisoners who proved reliable and hard-working. Newspaper editorials debate the question. Letters to editors argue both sides. Some Canadians support accepting former enemies who demonstrated good character. Others oppose allowing Germans to stay when Canadian veterans overseas still await return. The Canadian government wants to keep them. Officials recognize the value these men represent. Skilled workers, young, healthy, already integrated into communities, already proven trustworthy. The Minister of Labour discusses delaying repatriation. Proposals circulate to exchange German prisoners for Polish displaced persons if Britain objects to Canada keeping Germans. The economic calculation is straightforward. Losing 11,000 workers will hurt Canadian agriculture and industry at a critical moment of post-war reconstruction. But Britain says no. The Geneva Convention requires repatriation after hostilities cease. Germany surrendered but remains occupied. Britain controls repatriation logistics and insists all prisoners return. The official position holds that prisoners must be processed through the United Kingdom first, then gradually returned to Germany under proper supervision. Exceptions cannot be made. International law must be respected. The precedent of allowing prisoners to remain in captor nations could create complications in future conflicts. December 1946. The last German prisoners leave Canada. 18 months after war's end. Every single one of the 6,000 who requested to stay is forced to return. They board ships bound for Britain, process through demobilization centers, eventually transfer to occupied Germany, where they confront the reality they tried to avoid. Cities in ruins, economy collapsed, families scattered or dead. Soviet occupation in the east, Allied occupation in the west, a nation divided physically and spiritually by the catastrophe Hitler brought upon it. But the story does not end with repatriation. Many prisoners who worked Canadian farms maintained relationships with the families who employed them. Letters crossed the Atlantic, requests for sponsorship, applications for immigration. Slowly, steadily, former prisoners found ways back to Canada through legal channels. They returned not as prisoners, but as immigrants. Landed citizens building new lives in the country that treated them better as enemies than their homeland treated them as veterans. Harry Pohl returns in 1951, 19 years old when captured as a merchant seaman. Worked on a farm near Brooks, Alberta during his captivity. Went home to Hamburg after repatriation. Married. Told his wife immediately, "I'm going back to Canada." She agreed. They immigrated together. Pohl worked the same farm where he had been a prisoner. Knew at least 36 other former prisoners who returned to southern Alberta. Built a life in the community that welcomed him despite the war. Alfred Weiss does better still. Worked farms as a prisoner near Picture Butte, returned to Germany after the war, came back to Canada and purchased the farm where he once worked as a prisoner. The land he tended while behind barbed wire became his own property, his own livelihood, his own future. Siegfried Bruce and Tony Kleimacher become business partners. Bruce served as a U-boat officer. Kleimacher flew for the Luftwaffe, both imprisoned in Canada. Both returned to Germany after the war. Both came back to Canada and established a large, successful real estate firm in North Bay, Ontario. Bruce explains his choice simply. "I like Canadians. They made my life as pleasant as possible from the day I came here as a prisoner. Later, when I returned as a landed immigrant, I knew this was my country. There was also the feeling that you could create something here, that you could achieve what you wished in this land." Horst Brown worked timber camps in northern Ontario during captivity, enjoyed the work, appreciated the landscape. When repatriated to Germany, he describes being terribly homesick for Canada. Could not wait to return. A Canadian co-worker from the logging camp sponsored his immigration. Braun rebuilt his life in the forests where he once worked as a prisoner. Rudolf Ries worked the farm of Joe and Mary Kaser near Lethbridge, became like family according to their daughter Bessie, who recalled decades later that he integrated completely into their household. When the war ended and prisoners left, the Kaiser family hoped Riez would find a way back. Many wanted to return, but faced bureaucratic obstacles, immigration quotas, sponsorship requirements, years-long waits. Not every prisoner who wished to stay found a legal path. The relationships between guards and prisoners proved equally lasting. Doran Degenstein's father served in the Veterans Guard at Lethbridge, spoke fondly of his time with prisoners, developed mutual respect, left loaded rifles on truck seats, and asked prisoners to move vehicles during farm work. Trust built through months of interaction, shared humanity recognized, despite being on opposite sides of a global conflict. The contrast with other theaters becomes stark in retrospect. More than 1 million German prisoners died in Soviet captivity. Brutal conditions, forced labor, starvation, exposure, disease, execution. Japanese camps killed thousands of Allied prisoners through systematic abuse. German camps varied widely, but many imposed harsh conditions, especially as the war turned against Germany. Canada's camps stand out for adherence to Geneva Convention standards and often exceeding those minimums. The prisoners noticed, remembered, chose to return to the nation that imprisoned them humanely rather than remain in the nation that sent them to war. Canadian public opinion remained divided even years after the war. The Royal Canadian Legion passed a resolution at its 1946 Dominion Convention opposing any German prisoners remaining in Canada. Veterans who fought overseas resented the idea of former enemies staying while they struggled to readjust to civilian life. But others recognized that individual men should not be judged by the regime they served. Letters to newspapers argued that prisoners who proved themselves in farms and factories deserved consideration as desirable immigrants. The debate reflected deeper questions about forgiveness, reconciliation, and whether individuals bore collective responsibility for national crimes. By 1971, the Canadian government transferred remains of the 137 German prisoners who died in Canadian camps to a German war cemetery in Kitchener, Ontario. Families attended the ceremony. Mourning finalized decades after losses. Most prisoners died of natural causes: cancer, heart disease, accidents. 5 were hanged in Lethbridge Jail in 1946 for murders of fellow prisoners carried out under orders from internal Nazi leadership. Several deaths in timber operations raised suspicions, but investigations proved inconclusive. The ceremony honored all dead regardless of circumstance. German families appreciated Canada's respect for their fallen even when those men died as enemies on foreign soil. The prisoners who returned to Canada brought families, showed wives and children the camps where they lived, the farms where they worked, the mountains they admired, the communities that treated them well. Their descendants became Canadians, integrated into society, contributed to the economy, built businesses, raised families, forgot nothing of their fathers' and grandfathers' experiences as prisoners who preferred captivity in Canada to freedom in Germany. Most Canadians never knew 34,000 German prisoners lived in camps across their country during World War II, never learned about Lethbridge and Medicine Hat, holding 12,500 prisoners each, never heard about orchestras and sports leagues and educational programs that occupied prisoners for years, never understood that enemy combatants received better food than Canadian civilians under rationing, never discovered that 6,000 Germans requested to stay after the war, never realized that veterans guards from the First World War treated prisoners with a humanity shaped by their own memories of war's brutality. The recognition gap exists where foreign nationals remember Canadian actions better than Canadians themselves. German families whose fathers and grandfathers were imprisoned in Canada know the story intimately. They return to visit camps that no longer exist, stand on land where barbed wire once surrounded dormitories, thank Canadians they meet for treatment their relatives received 80 years ago. But most Canadians walk past former campsites without knowing what stood there. Drive highways built over Osada Camp without realizing 12,000 tents once covered that ground. Live in communities where German immigrants built lives without knowing those immigrants first arrived as prisoners of war. Harry Pole died in southern Alberta, surrounded by the farming community he joined as a 19-year-old prisoner. Siegfried Bruce and Tony Klemacher built successful businesses and employed Canadians in North Bay. Horst Brown raised a family in the forests he loved. Alfred Weiss farmed land he first worked behind barbed wire. Hundreds of others returned quietly, integrated silently, built lives that contributed to Canada's post-war prosperity without drawing attention to their unusual path to citizenship. The camps are gone now. Lethbridge and Medicine had sites redeveloped. Concrete slabs occasionally visible where dormitories stood. Buildings dismantled. Guard towers removed. Barbed wire torn down. Land returned to other uses. Museums preserve artifacts. Photographs, prisoner artwork, orchestral programs, sports equipment, handicrafts sold to guards and civilians decades ago, stories recorded from aging prisoners who returned to visit one last time before death, interviews with children of veterans' guards who heard their fathers speak fondly of Germans they supervised, evidence of a moment when enemies treated each other with unexpected humanity. The legacy lives in immigration statistics never compiled, in families who do not advertise their origin stories, in communities where German surnames arrived through unusual channels, in the principle that adherence to international law, even during total war, serves long-term interests better than revenge or cruelty, in the recognition that individual human beings deserve dignity, regardless of the uniform they wear or the flag they serve. Britain forced every prisoner to return in 1946. The Geneva Convention required it. International law demanded it. But international law could not prevent men from choosing their own futures once properly processed and released, could not stop them from applying to immigrate, from finding Canadian sponsors, from returning legally to the country that treated them better as prisoners than their homeland treated them as citizens. 6,000 requested to stay immediately. Thousands more found ways back across the Atlantic once the bureaucratic obstacles cleared. They voted with their feet, chose captors over countrymen, chose the nation that fed them well, housed them properly, allowed them culture and education and recreation over the nation that sent them to fight wars of conquest that destroyed Europe and ultimately themselves. The story belongs to Canada, but Canadians largely forgot it. Belongs to Germany, but Germans remember it differently. Belongs to individuals who made choices that shaped their families for generations. Harry Pole telling his wife in Hamburg that he was going back to Canada. Siegfried Bruce explaining that Canada felt like his country more than bombed-out Germany ever could. Horst Brown homesick for forests in Ontario while standing in the ruins of his homeland. Men who learned that the nation you fight for and the nation you belong to are not always the same. That sometimes enemies treat you better than friends. That humanity persists even in prisons, when laws require it, and men choose to honor those laws. 6,000 German prisoners refused to leave Canada after World War II. Britain made them leave anyway. Many found their way back, built lives, raised families, became Canadians, never forgot that barbed wire in Alberta felt more like home than freedom in Germany, never stopped being grateful for treatment they never expected to receive, never stopped telling their children about orchestras and hockey leagues and farmers who trusted them with loaded rifles, about veterans' guards who remembered the trenches and refused to replicate the hatred that defined that earlier war, about a country that took Geneva Convention requirements seriously even when its own civilians sacrificed under rationing, about the choice they made to return to the nation that imprisoned them because imprisonment there meant dignity that freedom elsewhere could not provide. The camps are gone. The prisoners are dead. But their descendants remain. Canadians now, Germans once. Prisoners in between. Living reminders that war creates strange circumstances and stranger outcomes. That 6,000 men once preferred enemy captivity to homeland freedom. That many got exactly what they wanted, despite international law saying otherwise. That the nation which treats its enemies well earns loyalty that victory alone cannot command.